Hello my creative friends, it's time to take another art break, and today we're going to continue on with this little series I'm creating of these whimsical style animals who are flying with these butterfly wings over these almost storybook style landscapes. We first started out with Miss Whiskers, and her tutorial is up. You can check it out on my page. And then today we're going to be working on Charlie. Isn't he adorable? He's this big old little Basset Hound with those ginormous ears and those big paws. He's such a chunky looking dog. So fun to paint and create. For those of you who'd like to paint along with me, but drawing's not your thing, I do have a sketchbook membership. That's where I have all of the line drawings for any of the paintings I do on my channel. You can go ahead and click that Ko-fi feed, not click, but scan that Ko-fi code right there. It'll take you right over to my shop. And I so appreciate all those who become sketchbook members and support my channel that way. Thank you so much for doing so. Well, let's get started with creating Charlie. Grab your watercolors. Let's give Mr. Charlie a little bit of a tailwind and see how far this little cute guy can fly. For this painting, I'm using the Canson XL watercolor paper in 140 pound. I've used a light box and traced on my image. I always draw on copy paper first and then trace it onto the watercolor paper. I'm using some Scotch tape to tape off a border, but I always put that Scotch tape on my clothes before I put it on my paper. I'm using the Paul Rubin brand of watercolor. Use whatever you might have and just always upgrade your watercolor paper just a little bit. You're going to get a better result if you do so. I'm using a very limited amount of color, and I'm using a number 6 Princeton watercolor brush to do the whole painting in. The first step I'm going to start with is to paint the sky. First, I'm going to start out with some clear water, and I'm going to put the clear water all around the dog and any of the buildings, all the way down to the horizon line. I want to make sure that the water stays out of any of my other elements. Watercolor always wants to flow where the paper is wet, so I'm going to try to keep those areas as dry as I can so that when I paint in my sky, the blue will be in the area that I want it to be in, and it won't be going in any of those other areas. Watercolor is very much a translucent art medium, and you can't make changes very well. So I know I want to keep my blue, sky blue, of course, but I don't want it in running too much into my animals or my other buildings. So first I go ahead and apply the clear water. You can see how it's shiny, but I don't have a lot of puddles. That's what you're looking for. You want your paper to be wet without having a lot of puddles. Once you get that step done, then we're going to start adding our paint. I'm choosing just a light shade of blue. It's in my set. You can see it up there in the square. If you're a sketchbook membership, I always give you a shot of the colors or references for your inspiration of what colors you could use to paint yours with. When you're doing skies, the darkest part of your sky is at the top, and as you move down your horizon, your sky gets a little lighter. So I'm going to start with my darkest blue at the top, and then when I'm about almost to the bottom area, I'm just going to use some clear water and try to go up into that blue and then fade it all the way down to almost a nothing towards the horizon line. When you're doing clouds, I'm going to be painting those next, so I still want to paint my clouds, or lift color actually is what I'm going to be doing with some toilet paper is what I'm going to use. I'm going to be lifting that color while this paint is still wet. So you want to quickly get your water on and then quickly get your colors on, because we're going to be lifting out some color to create the clouds. I'm using the toilet paper because I like the thin nature of the toilet paper. It usually doesn't have very much pattern on it, and I'm just going to be lifting some of that blue. Your larger clouds are going to be at the very top, and as you move down, your clouds are going to get a little smaller. That's just going to give your sky a lot more depth. Have that darker color at the top, have it really light at horizon. Your larger clouds are going to be at the top with little wispies, smaller clouds towards the horizon line. Now I can slightly tweak those areas where maybe my color didn't go all the way in where I wanted it, or perhaps I even got just a little bit of the blue over in an area I didn't want it. I can take my brush, clean it out with some clear water, give it a squeeze, and then kind of softly tickle those areas and lift the color. Now you don't want to do this too much, otherwise you kind of make your paper really fuzzy looking. So you just want to lightly tickle it and see if you can lift some of the colors. And that way you won't have it in the area, but in the long run, it really probably won't make that much of a difference. This is the stage I'm going to start working on those rolling hills, and I've already decided pretty much the color combinations I want to use. With watercolor, it's hard to make changes, so it's a great idea to kind of have an idea of the direction you want to go so you can start building your colors that way. Watercolor is very much a translucent quality material, so you're going to start out with the color that's actually your highlights. So you start out light and bright and then work your way darker. You're always painting the shadows when you're working with watercolor. Since watercolor is so translucent, you are going to be layering on several different layers. You can add the same color, another layer of that color, it will change the look of it. It doesn't have to be more pigment or even a different color to change the look. You're just going to build your colors nice and slow. I always use at least two different layers, if not three, or maybe even four, just depending on how I want things to look. How I like to paint my painting is I like to move my colors all the way around my painting. So if I have some of the color at the top of the painting, most likely I'm going to be using those same colors down low and perhaps in the middle as well. You're going to see I'm using just this limited palette. I'm using it on the dog and my hillsides and the buildings too. I'm not changing up a lot. I will be adding more texture at the end once my watercolor is dry, using some pen, micron pen, and some colored pencils, of course, to add all the little scribbly bits. If you watch my channel, you know I love this step of adding all the little scribble bits to add even a little bit more texture and interest to my paintings. This little pup was so much fun to paint. I do not have a lot of experience with painting dogs, so I had to look up a photo reference of an image of what a Basset Hound looks like. Definitely the characteristics of a Basset Hound are those big old ears and those big paws, and he's kind of got that short little squatty style body, and his tail isn't really all that long. But that just helped really for me to be able to see a reference photo and then go ahead and draw it out. And of course I do whimsical style, so mine is not realistic. So his ears are kind of flying in the air and he's just got kind of a really little happy look to himself. I wanted to keep the colors on the dogs very simple, so I just chose like 3 different shades of brown and a little bit of rust. I did add just a tiny bit of black. This is very much a traditional Basset Hound color. He's got that little saddle back area on his back and just a little bit on his tail, a little bit on his paws, and just some shadows of the back leg and the front legs on there as well too. Now those little white areas, if you don't want to leave them all white, is to really water down your paint a lot. Even more than just tea, just a tiny bit of color on there, and that'll give you just kind of a nice way to shade your white areas and they'll still look a little bit more white without adding a lot of color to those areas. But I'm going to make sure I have a shadow on that back ear down towards his head to give it that dimension, and then there'll be a brighter spot at the top. I'm going to make sure that I have shadows underneath that ear that's facing forward to give it a little bit more dimension. I'm going to be adding a little bit of texture to the front of his face in that white area by adding a few little tick marks with some pen work and some colored pencils to add even a little bit more texture. Now I'm going to let all of that dry. I don't want to get too far ahead. I didn't want that saddleback area on the back of the dog to run into my ears. I wanted to keep those very separate. And anytime you want to keep your colors separate and not have it run into another color, you need to let that area dry before you work on your next one. So the back area, I wanted it to feel separate from his ears. So I'm going to let that dog dry, the parts I have painted, and then move on to the next areas. Now here you can see I've already started to work on those next layers for the buildings in the front. I'm just deepening my colors, basically adding the same color that I had before, and maybe even picking up a little bit of the brown and creating my own colors. This step, it's okay to go ahead and mix your colors on these small buildings. So if you have a color that's wet and you want to tap in just the tiniest bit of, like on the red, I'm tapping in just a little bit of the rust or maybe a dark brown. That's called a wet on wet technique. So I'm letting my colors blend and coming up with another color by it's doing its own little watercolor magic. Now these hills, I'm going to start adding the next layer on those as well, and I'm basically using the same color I did. I'm just adding another layer, and that's going to darken it. Watercolor always dries lighter, so what it looks like when it's wet will be lighter as it dries. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of the highlights showing of the color if I can, but even if I do lose that first color, I'm okay with that because I know I'm going to be adding more rich tones on top of those areas, so I'm just going to build it as I go. Now I'm mixing off to the side a little bit of blue and a little bit of green colors to darken that turquoise area, and it looks a lot darker, but once you add a lot more water to it, it's going to lighten. So again, on that area, I'm going to end up adding one more layer of color there, and then I'll add some more interest with the color pencils in the end. And this is just the next steps on those one in the front. So I have a little bit of a rust hill and then adding some more red to bring that red down from the buildings at the center point. I'm going to make sure I have some red at the very bottom of my painting as well. And again, you just build these slowly. You just build up your colors as you're going. Add a little bit more on it. You can always take your dryer system too, like a hair dryer or a heat tool. Dry your colors if you need to before you start your next layers to see what colors you need to have. And it's always a good idea, it kind of sounds funny, but is to squint your eyes and when you're looking at your painting. Then you can see if you have enough darks and lights. It's harder to add the lights back in, but you can do that with at the end with perhaps a little bit of color pencil or even a little more of a white ink mark with using like a Uniball pen. You can add some bright whites back in there that way, but basically what you're doing is you're squinting to see if you have enough contrast with your darker shadows. So the dog has dried enough that I can go ahead and add that darker patch on his back. I'm going to start out with a darker shade of brown, but I'm going to mix a very light shade of black and apply it to that area as well while the color is still wet. I'm just tapping it in with the tip of my brush and letting the colors kind of work on their own. I'm going to add a little bit of that black to the front paw, the one that's behind. I'm going to add a little bit of that color to the back of his tail, just to add another darker shade there. Wherever you think you might want a nicer dark shadow, you can put a little bit of that color in. Now this is where I get to add a little bit of fun. I'm going to be adding some bright colors to the doors, adding some differences. So on the red tall building, house building, I'm going to give it a turquoise door. And then on that small little door on the center one, I'm going to make that red too. So this is just a fun time to experiment with your colors and layer in how you think you would like to have them layered on. There's no real rules. You could just create it as you go. Here I'm adding just a tiniest bit of color wash onto those white areas just to give it a little bit more interest than just being plain white, but it's still going to have a white feeling. I do have some blue paint at the very tip of my tail that I'm trying to remove. I could remove some, but it really was staining the paper, so it's a little harder to get off. But in the end, it's not very super noticeable. I'm going to be using my Micron pen to go ahead and do some ink work at the end so I can sketch around it, and it's still going to give me that feel of that there's a tip of white at the top of that tail. Now I'm going in and adding just a little bit of a darker detail to the nose. The inside of the eyes of animals are always very colorful, so I have some of that rust color inside of the eyes. I'm going to be using my Micron pens to fill in the majority of the black part of the eyes, and I'm not going to try to do it with my brush. The eyes are kind of important when you're doing animals. It's just really going to bring them to life when you have those dark, colorful eyes, but always trying to leave just a tiny bit of white inside of there as the catch light, because all living things have a catch light in their eye. So if you can leave a little spot when you're scribbling in the eye with your Micron pen or whatever you might use, and that looks just the best, is to have an irregular line that's inside of there, a round little, instead of just a round little dot. If you can get more of an irregular catch light, it looks great if you can do it that way. Here I am, I'm using my brush and I'm just kind of hand brushing in the fence posts. And I like doing the lines down first, and then I like going across and having them look very irregular and not even. These are going to dry a little bit lighter, so it's not the finished look. I'm going to go in with a Micron pen and add more detail to the fence posts. With this painting, I do have two sheep that are in the background as well, and I have been painting around them, so I'm trying to keep them white if I can, but if you do get a little bit of the color blended into it, it'll be fine. In the end, I'm going to be doing more pen work around it, and then creating their black faces using a pen and their dark little tails as well. So I'm just going to keep on layering my colors, and it's just about done, and then I'm going to dry it and start with the pen work. I'm going to take a quick little break right here if you watched this far. Thanks for watching. And I wanted to remind you, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and do it. It's a free thing and it really does help my channel grow. It just pushes it out there so much more. If you let YouTube know that you like this, and maybe somebody else would too. And click that bell if you'd like to have notifications of any future videos I might put up. Well, let's keep on going and let's keep on painting. I'm adding just the final details to the top. I'm going to make the collar of my dog that teal color, so that brings that color to the top of my painting. I'm going to be painting the little heart on his collar red. That way it's going to bring that color of the red to the top of the painting as well. And for the wings, I'm just going to do a simple little color wash of the turquoise. I'm going to be adding more detail to the wings with my color pencils and a little bit of Uniball pen too. Well, I'm going to give this a dry, and then I'm going to start with the Micron pens. The color of the pen I'm going to be using is the sepia tone, and I'm going to be using a very small nib size in the 005. Canson watercolor paper is fairly smooth, so I can use these very small nibs of a pen. If your paper is actually slightly more bumpy, you may have to bump up on that nib size. It will work just a lot better if your paper is a little bit more textured. When I'm doing the outlining, I like to do more of a hand sketch look, so I'm looking at not actually copying everything exact. I'm looking to maybe double up on my lines and skipping areas and just having broken line work as well. I love that look of having just more of a hand sketch quality, so that's the way I like to do mine. There's no real or wrong or right way to do this look. You just do what makes you happy, and I love those little broken hand sketch looking lines, so that's what I'm going for. Now this is when you're going to start to see those sheep come to life. I'm going to be adding the black faces and the little dark tails. And as soon as you do that, it reads that it's a sheep. I add little tiny legs to the bottom as well. And this small little pen works perfect to add all of those little details to that small little animal. When adding the line work, there is no real right or wrong way to do it, and you just add it until it makes you feel happy about your line work, and just knowing that you can always go back in and add more if you would like. At this stage, I'm going to bring in my color pencils, and I love the way that color pencils look with watercolor. It's just another layer of texture you can add, and it's really fun to be able to add some colors in that perhaps you didn't use in your watercolor. And you can use this little sketching idea of adding some more color, but using a different medium. It's one of my favorite ways to add texture to watercolor. Another way I like using the color pencils in these little paintings is to add patterns to the inside of the hills. It gives it almost a fabric quality to it, and it really does boost that whimsical feeling of this painting. You can get as creative as you want here. There's no right or wrong way to do it. You just add the patterns that makes you feel happy and keep on adding line work until you think it's done. So I just keep on adding different patterns, and I'm going to go in with a little bit of Uniball white ink as well. So I'm going to finish up my color pencil and then bring in the Uniball pen. The Uniball pen is a great pen to use if you would like to add a little bright white patterns or highlights to your painting. If you happen to lose the catch lights in your eyes, it's a great way to add just the tiniest bit of catch light there as well. But I'm using it here to create a flower pattern, and I'm going to come in with just a little bit of white here and there. I kind of treat white as almost like glitter in these paintings. Just a little bit goes a long ways. And now I'm going to start working on those wings, and I just layer in a little bit of color here and there, and then I come back in with my pencil, my darker pencil, and I make the lines for the wings. And that's all I really do for those areas. Well, let's take the tape off and take a look at what it looks like sitting in my studio among some of the other things I've created so far on my YouTube channel. I also wanted to share with you this adorable little workshop I have inside of my Ko-fi shop. This is a summer wing collection of these 3 little ghosties. All have little pals with them. I give you the tracers so you can easily trace and paint, and then I walk you through the painting steps of how to create this adorable trio of summer wing ghosts. And here's Charlie. He's looking so cute. I just love the way this pup turned out, and that storybook landscaping adds that extra whimsical character to this painting. If you wouldn't mind giving me a comment or a thumbs up, it really can help my channel grow. And thanks for joining me, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again, and perhaps next time you'll paint right along with me.